Hey folks, let's have some resistance history talk about the Constitution and the nature of history as part of some of the work that I'm doing right now. You want to know how to figure out who actually won a historical fight? Look at the name calling. If you ever find somebody referring to a loyalist of the American Revolution as a Tory, not true. It means you're talking to somebody who understands that the Patriots won. They get to determine the terms of the history, how we get to frame them. And it's the same thing when we're talking about the Constitution. We talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists like they were equal factions. But that's the Federalists' version of the story, their terms of debate. That's how you know that they won the history. The other side never called themselves anti-federalists. They weren't that coherent. They weren't against government. They certainly weren't against a central government. They certainly weren't against strengthening a federal government. They were against a governmental system imposed on them without debate, shoved down their throats without the input of the people, which is what the terms of ratification ended up being. And this is an interesting twist. The Federalists lost their battle, at least on their major point. They saw the Constitution that emerged from the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 as an all-or-nothing game. It was perfect. It did everything it needed to do. Those few people in the room in Philadelphia answered all of the questions that needed to be answered, went through all of the issues that needed to be resolved, and the Constitution they came up with could not be improved upon, certainly couldn't be improved upon by somebody who wasn't there, certainly couldn't be improved upon by the people. That's precisely what Hamilton and Madison thought. So they wanted no changes, no public input, no debate, take it or leave it, and they wanted it ratified quickly. Shove it down the throats of the people, get it done, or else, in their view, the country was going to fall apart, although there's no evidence that there was any kind of real crisis facing the United States at that point. So the opposition fought for exactly what the Federalists, the Nationalists, the extreme Nationalists didn't want. They wanted the right for the people to be heard and the ability to shape that Constitution, shape their form of government before it became permanent, not after, because it would become much harder than that given the terms of the amendment process built into the Constitution. And in that fight, the opponents to the Federalists, the opponents to the Naturalists, won. They pushed so hard and so effectively that the Federalists had no choice but to accept amendments, including the Bill of Rights that everybody thinks is the heart of the Constitution, or risk losing everything else. So the Constitution that the Federalists wanted, the one that they alone wrote, and that they thought that they alone should have a say about, never existed, never went into effect. The people forced change before the ink was dry, limits on that power that they thought that they had established without limitations. But this wasn't just a political battle. It was a continuation of the revolution itself, which makes it even more interesting. Many of the radical patriots, and this is something that I think that when you get into the human dynamics of that period, that place, that time, makes it even more interesting and more rich when you factor in all of the people who weaved in and out of authority and power and determining exactly what was going on at the time. Many of the radical powers who had led the colonies into independence in the middle of the 1770s, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Mercy Otis Warren, the old revolutionaries, saw their vision of the American Revolution absolutely betrayed by the younger generation of framers. Hamilton, Madison, those folks who had not been of their number at the beginning, who hadn't been members of the Sons of Liberty, who hadn't pushed for opposition to the British Parliament in all of those battles following the 7 Years' War leading up to Lexington and Concord. To the original revolutionaries, independence was never, ever about creating a strong, centralized national government. It was about self-government, about protecting individual rights against the very kinds of violations that they had fought the British over. And they returned to a new fight over those same issues not 5 years after the end of the War for Independence. Because to men like Hamilton and Madison, the revolution wasn't a principle to uphold. And that becomes very clear in all of their writings, not just the Federalist. Thank you. It was a foundation to build upon in a different direction. That's what the revolution was about. Independence was a new toy for them to play with in nation building. The Federalists saw the new government that they were creating as an opportunity to shape a powerful national structure, not to preserve liberty, but to expand state authority in ways that the original revolutionaries never ever intended. So in the battle over ratification, two revolutions collided. The original revolution, fought by those who had risked everything for independence, and now saw their core principles under threat without explicit protection. And the Federalists' version, even though the people like Washington and Franklin were among them, so many of the older people thought that they had, in fact, turned their back on the revolution. So the Federalist version, led by those men, and believed that securing power on the world stage required a strong centralized government, were seen as being out of step by the old revolutionaries, wanting to build a different country than the one that the revolutionaries thought that they were creating. But the radicals wanted guarantees, clearer protections for individual rights before power was consolidated. And in that fight, they forced the Federalists into a corner. But the biggest losers of all were the 1 out of every 5 Americans who were enslaved people. No patriot, no framer, no so-called defender of liberty considered them citizens for even a moment, considered even the possibility. There was just the ghost of John Lawrence shaking his head at them. And it took a major concession just to consider them 3/5 of a human being, and that only for the sake of strengthening white political power. There was no grand debate at the Constitutional Convention over the hypocrisy of slavery in a nation built on liberty, of including them in we the people. There was some hand-wringing about slavery being immoral, but not a thought of ending it, just ending the slave trade in 20 years. That was the context of the debate. And even that, ending the slave trade, was a sticking point. The real concern wasn't whether slavery should exist, but whether the Constitution, like a Massachusetts court had just interpreted into the Massachusetts state constitution, could be construed as a threat to slavery's future. We can talk about Elizabeth Freeman. Only when opponents were satisfied that it wouldn't do that by the basic functioning of the Constitution and its language, it would not result in freedom for enslaved people. Only then, that when they were assured that it didn't contain the seeds of abolition, that it actually strengthened slavery's foundations, did the opponents yield. So when we talk about winners and losers, what do we really mean? Because the Constitution that emerged from Philadelphia, that perfect document, that was a big loss, a swing and a miss. It lasted 3 generations, period. 75 years. Then the Civil War ripped the core out of its greatest inequality. And it took a war to do it. No peaceful measure was ever going to end slavery. And then 50 years after that, more of the framers' work went out the window. The direct election of senators instead of state legislatures picking them. Women's suffrage. Basic expansions of democracy they never intended. And today, we're seeing the same structural weaknesses that the original revolutionaries feared and argued against being exploited again in our presidency, in our judiciary, in Congress, and its feckless leadership. So ask yourself, if all of this stopped tomorrow, if all of the political chaos, if all of the corruption, if selling used cars on the White House lawn and dysfunction suddenly froze, could we just go back to business as usual? Could we trust that the new groups in charge would behave better? Or do we finally have to admit that a constitution based on hope as a strategy, hope that people in power will do the right thing, hope that outdated structures will somehow manage to work today, has outlived its usefulness? The fight over the Bill of Rights was a continuation of the American Revolution. And maybe if anyone really wants to inject meaning into the 250th anniversary of the United States, the only way forward is to fight the revolution's next battle, even literally.